October 17th, 1990. October 17th, 1990 was the birth of my first child. It was an eye-opening experience for a young dad. I remember being present in the room, and it seemed to be a very normal hospital bed. We didn't seem to have a lot of extra attention. People were coming and going, but no one was particularly frantic. They were monitoring Sandra very closely, and we waited. As we had waited for 9 months, actually as we had waited up to his due date and then past his due date. The doctor had said that wasn't unusual for a first child. He sent us actually to the mall to walk. That did not seem to speed young Zach along. My mother had other advice. She said to hit the railroad tracks on St. John Street at 40 miles per hour. Guess what worked? But we were there, and we were ready, and we were waiting. We were prepared for what was going to come next. And suddenly, as she became dilated to the proper range, everything changed just in an instant. And a nurse stepped over and manipulated something on the wall, and suddenly the ceiling kind of opened up, and lights and all this other stuff kind of dropped down out of it, and the bed came apart into a couple of pieces, and suddenly it became very, very real for me. In talking to Sandra about that later on, she said it had been very, very real for her for a long time. But that was what impending birth looked like for us as a family 25 years ago. We have an image of what birth looks like. We have an image of what the early life of a child looks like. We think we understand expectation and waiting. We think that we know what preparation means. But as it turns out, it's very, very individual, very, very specific to the time. And not just to the time, to the place. I've told y'all this story on more than one occasion, but it's one that I really can't escape from. It's one that I've never been able to get out of my mind at this time of year. Several years ago, in a hunting trip in Texas, we're on a large ranch east of Laredo in South Texas. And as we round a corner going back to the ranch compound on this dusty Caliche road, suddenly a group of folks run across the road in front of us. They are people who are looking for a home. People who are desperate enough to have crossed the Rio Grande and to have walked north into mesquite and cactus. Normally what we would do at that moment would be to call the Border Patrol, and they would send someone out. Or actually they would send someone to the nearest hard road, paved road, where they would be crossing sometime in the next few hours as they crossed this huge ranch. I'm watching this group of folks as they run across the road and into the mesquite and cactus. And one of them pauses and looks back at me. And our eyes lock for just a moment. And it was a young woman with a blue shawl carrying a baby at her breast. Fleeing, actually seeking a future. We have lots of images of mother and child, of family and children. Some of them powerful and wonderful, almost all of them overwhelming. What are the images that we've seen most recently? this past spring, an image that a great many of us saw, an image that was commented on by every possible news service, was of a child washed ashore on a beach in the Mediterranean. A child whose family had attempted to flee, and while they had survived, the baby had not. Reality. We read the stories here, or we listen to the stories told to us, and we have these sweet and beautiful images. And we turn them into stained glass, or we paint them, or we create a rite, a liturgy around them. But always remember that what we are talking about is reality, and what it looked like, and what it was, and what it felt like, but of course, more than that, what it means today. I think about families here who desperately want a child but are unable to have a child. I think about families who have registered with DSS, and nothing about the child matters except that it is a child that needs a home and needs a loving parent. And I think about the courage of that mother and father. I think about the reality of it. I think about what will likely happen here on Christmas Eve if Charlie Hayes comes. Charlie is the grandson of Barbara Hayes, a member who died several years ago. We baptized Charlie in the neonatal intensive care unit. And Charlie functions perhaps at about an 18-month-old level. And Charlie will be here, and Charlie will be very, very expressive. And he will make every visitor here that night profoundly uncomfortable. And what many people will realize, but some will not, is that Charlie will be Jesus. What is the reality of this beautiful story about Mary? The Magnificat comes from this, that great hymn of praise spoken by her. Well, I did a little research. I found an academic paper that looked at, of all things, infant mortality rates in first century Palestine. 30% of every child born in Palestine in the first century would have died within a year of childbirth. And they didn't count the baby girls. What about the life of the mother? Perhaps 1 in 7, but at least 1 in 8 would die in childbirth. That's reality. So when Mary and Elizabeth have this profound moment, when they encounter one another, when John leaps in the womb at the presence of Jesus, while it is an acknowledgement of the presence of God, the divinity of Christ, it is not a promise to either Mary or Elizabeth that they will see the children that they deliver grow up. What I mean by that is, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. John is the forerunner, the one who goes to prepare the way. And all the promises that we see made to Mary and to Elizabeth, none of them say, Mary, you will live to see your child as a grown man. None of them say, Mary, you will live to see your child as a 5-year-old. None of them say, Mary, you will survive child. Because we deal with reality. What we have to acknowledge is not Mary meek and mild, not lowly Mary, but rather Mary bold and courageous. Mary looking at life and seeing God's unforeseen possibilities laid out in front of her and willing to accept them and embrace them regardless of any consequence. And the same can be said of Elizabeth. Bold, brave women. Now, the last few weeks there has been a theme running through each of the sermons that I've preached. A theme about God's unforeseen possibilities, that what God offers to us is more and greater than we can comprehend or apprehend on our own. I'm not speaking about a gospel of prosperity at all. You will never hear that proclaimed here. I'm speaking about the gospel of the incarnation, the gospel of the crucifixion, the gospel of the resurrection. That when we give ourselves over to God, something inexplicable and unexplainable in any fashion occurs. That the possibilities, the dreams that we have for our own life are taken by God and given back to us in a way that is far more than we could have ever imagined. And that's what He does in the lives of these two women. Mary is not meek and mild. Mary is bold. Mary is courageous. Mary is a towering bastion of faith, willing to set aside every priority but God's and embrace it. When we talk about faith, when we talk about those people that we know, that we see who are faithful, we generally think of things like, well, they read or they study Scripture. Or they are present in church, they worship. Or they pray. They pray for others devoutly. Prayer, worship, study, all of those things are outward signs of faith. But they are actually only things that are preparatory. Preparatory. They are designed to make us into something else, to guide us into a new way of being. The purpose of all of those things, whether it's on December 20th, when finally it's cold outside, or it's on a hot summer day in July. The purpose of all of those things, the purpose of gathering in this place, of studying this, to falling to our knees to pray, is this: to make us all more like Mary.